Welcome to Power to Lie. In today's conflict map, we are examining the Russia-Ukraine war, who profits from the war that won't end, part 2. In the last episode, we built the board. Today, we follow the money. While more than 1 million people became casualties, order books exploded, tankers changed flags, and a $588 billion rebuilding business was born before the shooting stopped. This is who profits from the war that won't end, on every side. Let's start with what was destroyed, because that is where the money trail begins. According to the 5th Rapid Damage and Needs Assessment, a joint report by the government of Ukraine, the World Bank, the European Commission, and the UN published in February 2026, direct physical damage to Ukraine now exceeds $195 billion. Reconstruction and recovery needs are estimated at approximately $588 billion over the next decade. That is nearly 3 times Ukraine's entire 2025 GDP. The IMF estimates Ukraine needs approximately 137 billion euros in external financing in 2026 and 2027 alone. On the Russian side, credible estimates place military casualties near 1 million, though these figures remain contested and cannot be independently verified by this channel. Russia's economy has been placed on permanent war footing, military spending crowding out civilian investment, inflation running high, and a workforce pulled toward the front. But here is the question mainstream coverage rarely holds open long enough to answer. Where did the money go? The money didn't disappear. It moved. The most visible place it moved is into the arms industry. European Union defense spending rose from approximately 240 billion euros in 2022 to 279 billion in 2023, then 326 billion in 2024, and crossed 360 billion euros in 2025, exceeding 2.1% of European Union GDP. Germany committed a 100 billion euro special defense fund and a 500 billion euro multi-year package. France earmarked 850 billion euros for ammunition and drone stockpiles. The production numbers follow. European Union ammunition production capacity stood at roughly 300,000 rounds per year in 2022. By the end of 2025, it had reached approximately 2 million rounds per year. German defense industry orders rose approximately 50% in late 2025. The corporate numbers are not ambiguous. Rheinmetall reported full-year 2025 revenue of 9.9 billion euros, up 30% year-on-year, with a record operating profit of 1.8 billion euros, up 33%. Its order backlog stood at 63.8 billion euros, and was projected to reach 135 billion euros by the end of 2026. BAE Systems posted record annual sales of £30.7 billion in 2025, up 10%, with a record order backlog of £83.6 billion. European defense industry total turnover reached 183.4 billion euros in 2024, up 13.8% year-on-year, with 60 billion euros in defense exports. Here is where the analysis requires precision, because the easy narrative in one direction is wrong. These are not companies that started a war to sell weapons. They are companies that fill government orders, and those governments, many of which spent decades below NATO's 2% spending target while Russia's military budget grew, had a genuine security deficit. The case for European rearmament does not depend on the Ukraine war alone. It is a real strategic response to a real threat perception. Both things are true. The rearmament is a legitimate security response, and the balance sheets confirm that for European defense contractors, the timing has been extraordinary. Now, energy. Before February 2022, the United States exported approximately 18.9 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to the European Union each year. By 2022, that figure had jumped to 55 billion cubic meters. Today, the United States accounts for approximately 57 to 60% of Europe's total LNG imports. Europe imported a record 142 billion cubic meters of LNG in 2025, up 28% year-on-year. That is a structural shift in global energy trade, and it happened in roughly 36 months. Who paid for it? European industry and consumers, paying market-rate LNG prices, where they once paid pipeline prices that were among the cheapest in the industrial world. The German manufacturing model was built in part on that cheap gas. It no longer exists, but here is one detail most coverage misses. Despite the war, despite the sanctions, despite the rhetoric, the European Union paid approximately 6.7 billion euros for Russian LNG and 5.9 billion euros for Russian pipeline gas in 2025. European Union imports of Russian LNG hit a quarterly record in the first quarter of 2026, up 16% year-on-year. A full European Union ban on Russian LNG does not take effect until January 2027. So, Europe is simultaneously the largest customer of American LNG and still one of the largest customers of Russian gas. And then there is the American commercial stake. An S&P Global Commodity Insight study, published in May 2025, found that up to $120 billion in planned U.S. LNG project investment depends on the sanctions regime against Russian gas remaining in place. If sanctions unwind as part of a peace settlement, Russian gas becomes competitive again. American LNG projects currently under development face a different market. That is a documented U.S. commercial interest in how the sanctions framework evolves, not a conspiracy, a balance sheet. But the most profitable trade of this war doesn't happen in Washington or Brussels. It happens at sea, in refineries most people have never heard. India, China, and Turkey collectively processed approximately 1.2 billion barrels of Russian crude in 2025. How? Through what analysts call the refining loophole. Russian crude, refined in a third country, legally became a non-Russian product, exportable to the European Union, and, until recently, even to the United States. Global Witness, in analysis submitted as written evidence to the UK Parliament, estimated that European Union purchases of refined products from refineries using Russian crude sent approximately €1 billion to the Kremlin in 2023 alone. U.S. imports of such products were worth over $180 million in just 9 months of the same year. India's fuel export stream to Europe, built on Russian crude, processed primarily at the Jamnagar refinery, operated by Reliance, was estimated at up to $63 billion in annual revenue. India's Nayara Energy is 49% owned by Rosneft, Russia's state oil company. The financial beneficiaries of this arrangement are specific and documented. Reliance Industries through Jamnagar refining margins, Rosneft through its Nayara stake, and the Russian state budget through oil export revenues that flowed despite Western sanctions. And who ultimately pays? Russian energy revenue is funded indirectly by the consumers buying these refined products. The European Union's 18th sanctions package, which entered into force on the 21st of January 2026, moved to close this loophole by banning imports of refined products derived from Russian crude, regardless of country of origin. Turkey's Tüpraş refinery cut Russian crude imports by 69% in the month before the ban took effect. The oil price cap on Russian crude was lowered from $60 to $47.60 per barrel. The remaining enforcement gap, according to an energy research analyst cited by Radio Free Europe, is Chinese refineries with direct pipeline connections to Russian crude, not subject to European Union jurisdiction. The Indian government has argued that purchasing discounted Russian crude and processing it for export helped keep global oil prices lower for everyone, including European importers. The European Union's 18th package included exemptions for refined products from Canada, Norway, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Indian analysts have described those exemptions as restructuring trade flows in the West's favor, while penalizing Indian refiners who filled the same role. Whether that reading is correct is contested. Both are the documented positions on the table. What about Russia's own ledger? According to analysis by the KSE Institute, cited by the Peterson Institute for International Economics in March 2026, Russia could collect between $45 billion and $151 billion in additional 2026 budget revenue, depending on the duration and intensity of the Iran conflict. A Middle Eastern war that disrupts Iranian oil exports tightens global supply. That lifts prices. Russia, selling oil outside the Western sanctions regime, collects the difference. The U.S. Treasury extended sanctions relief on Russian oil during the Iran conflict as a market stabilization measure, a documented instance of sanctions bending when energy prices threaten to rise at home. China's position is structurally simpler. Discounted Russian crude is a subsidy for Chinese industrial production. Every barrel purchased below market rate is a competitive advantage embedded in the cost structure of Chinese manufacturing. That is not geopolitics, it is accounting. Russia's war economy runs on oil revenue. A prolonged Middle East conflict is Moscow's dividend on a second front. One war funds another. Now follow the money to where the war ends. Reconstruction needs $588 billion over 10 years. The sector breakdown, per the same assessment, transport infrastructure requires more than $96 billion. Energy systems approximately $91 billion. Housing approximately $90 billion. Commerce and industry, more than $63 billion. Agriculture, more than $55 billion. And to mining alone, approximately $28 billion. European and US firms are expected to capture the majority of contracts, and in April 2025, before the peace push intensified, the United States and Ukraine signed a critical minerals deal granting the United States long-term access to Ukraine's rare earth elements and critical raw materials. That deal was locked in first. The peace negotiations came after. Then there is the frozen asset question. Approximately 210 billion euros in Russian sovereign assets are immobilized in Europe. The majority held at Euroclear in Belgium. As part of an estimated $300 billion across the G7, the European Commission's reparations loan proposal would mobilize up to 210 billion euros, of which 115 billion is earmarked specifically for Ukraine's defense industrial capacity. In December 2025, European Union leaders agreed on a 90 billion euro loan for 2026 and 2027, borrowed on capital markets, after Belgium declined to approve the frozen asset route. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov described Western plans for the assets as theft of Russian property. Commission President von der Leyen countered that the assets are not being confiscated, that Ukraine would repay the loan if Russia pays reparations. The legal question is unresolved. The financial stakes are not. Peace is also a market. And who profits depends entirely on which peace, on whose terms, with which contracts already signed. Here is the uncomfortable symmetry. Every player on the Part 1 board has a line on this ledger. Moscow's oil windfall from elevated prices and Middle East volatility, Washington's LNG export revenue, and the critical minerals deal signed before the ceasefire. Europe's defense industry, running at capacity for the first time in decades. Delhi's refining margins, built on discounted crude, processed through refineries, partly owned by the country, those margins benefit. Beijing's structural input subsidy from below-market Russian energy. None of this proves anyone wanted the war. That claim would require evidence of intent, and this channel will not state as fact what the evidence does not prove. What the evidence does show is a web of financial dependencies that makes the calculus of resolution genuinely complicated, not because the actors are malicious, but because too many balance sheets now depend on which way the war ends. Every actor has an interest in the outcome. Not all of those interests point toward the same settlement, and that is why the war that everyone says they want to end has proven so difficult to stop. 2. We do not tell you what to think. We show you what changed, who benefits, and what the evidence says. There is a concrete number behind all of this. The G7's $50 billion loan to Ukraine is repaid not from the frozen Russian principal, but from the profits those immobilized assets keep generating. The reserves stay locked. Their earnings fund the war. Moscow calls it theft. Brussels calls it a reparations loan. Reconstruction itself is becoming an asset class. Von der Leyen has announced what she calls the largest equity fund in the world for rebuilding Ukraine, with a first closing of up to 500 million euros. European and American firms are expected to win most of the contracts. That's Conflict Map for today. If you want to see how political narratives are fact-checked with data, true, false, or framed is coming soon. And if you want to understand how history explains the present, history behind the lie is also on the way. Subscribe so you don't miss either. Thank you for watching. See you next time.